There is a letter I never wrote. It has been 60 years, and I still know exactly what it would have said, because I composed it in my head 100 times in the weeks before my son left, and 1,000 times in the weeks after he was gone, and I have been composing it ever since, in the small hours of the morning when sleep does not come, and the mind goes where it goes without asking permission. I know every word of the letter I never wrote. I could recite it to you now, in this room, at 70 years old, as fluently as I could have recited it in the autumn of 1861, when I should have written it and did not. I did not write it because I thought there was time. That is the whole of it. That is the reason that has taken up more space in my life than any other reason I have ever had for anything. I thought there was time, and there was not time, and my son went to his death believing that his mother was angry with him. And I have thought about this every hour of every day for 60 years, and I will think about it every hour of every day for whatever hours remain to me. My name is Dorothy Ruth Haskins, born Crane in the year 1851 in Pendleton County, in the part of Virginia that became West Virginia during the war, in the mountains of the eastern Allegheny Range where the land is steep, and the farms are small, and the winters come early and stay late. I am 70 years old. I have lived in this county all my life, except for the 2 years I spent in Staunton after my first husband died. And I know these mountains the way you know a place that has shaped you whether you wanted it to or not, the way the mountains themselves know the weather, which is to say completely and without choice. I had 4 children. William was the eldest, born in 1868, and then came Clara in 1871, and then Robert in 1874, and then the youngest, my son Daniel, born in 1876. It is Daniel I am going to tell you about. It is always Daniel. But I need to tell you first about the years before Daniel, because the person I was when Daniel was born was made by those years, and the person I was when Daniel left was made by all the years between his birth and his leaving. And you cannot understand the letter I did not write without understanding the woman who did not write it. I was born the 4th of 6 children to Edward and Mary Crane, who farmed 110 acres of mountain country in Pendleton County. My father was a hard man, not cruel but hard, in the way of mountain farmers who have learned that the land does not accommodate softness, and who have applied this lesson broadly to themselves and to the people around them. He worked from first light to last light every day of his life that his health permitted, and he expected the same from his children, and he got it, because the expectation was enforced not through punishment, but through the more effective mechanism of example. You did not slack in Edward Crane's household because Edward Crane did not slack, and the gap between his standard and any lesser standard was too visible and too constant to be comfortably inhabited. My mother was a different kind of person. She was warm in the way that some people are warm, not performatively, but essentially, as though warmth were her natural temperature, and cooling down required deliberate effort. She sang while she worked, which my father never did, and she told us stories in the evenings when the work was done. And she had a way of putting her hand on your shoulder when you were struggling with something that communicated, without words, that the struggling was seen, and that it was all right to struggle. I loved my mother completely, and I learned from her the things that cannot be taught by instruction, which are the most important things. I married my first husband, George Haskins, in 1869 when I was 18 years old. George was a good man from a farm 2 valleys east, steady and reliable, and possessed of the same quality of hard work that I had grown up with, which I recognized as a virtue, because I had been raised to recognize it as such. We had 2 children together, William and Clara, before George died of a fever in the winter of 1874, leaving me a widow at 23 with a 5-year-old and a 3-year-old and a farm that needed managing. I managed it with the help of my father and my brothers for 2 years, and then I married my second husband, James Haskins, who was George's younger brother, and who had been helping with the farm since George's death, and who proposed to me on a Sunday in October of 1876, with a directness that I found, under the circumstances, appropriate. James was not George. He was harder in his temperament and less given to warmth, a man who expressed himself through action rather than through any form of verbal or physical tenderness. And I accepted this because I was not a young woman looking for romance, but a 25-year-old widow with 2 children and a farm who needed a reliable partner and who had found one. Robert was born in 1874 before George died, and Daniel was born in 1876, several months after I married James. Daniel was James's son in the biological sense, and George's son in no sense, which is a distinction that I mention because it is relevant to what came later and to the particular shape of the relationship between James and Daniel, which was never what it should have been, and which I spent years trying to compensate for through my own relationship with the boy. Daniel was the most like me of all my children. This is not something I say because he is gone, and the dead acquire virtues in memory that the living sometimes lack. It is something I believed when he was alive and that I have not revised in 60 years. He had my mother's warmth, which had skipped me to some degree and come through me into him more fully, and he had my father's stubbornness, which had not skipped anyone in our family for several generations. He was quick to laugh and slow to forget a wrong, which is a combination that makes for interesting company and occasionally difficult relationships. And he had a quality of directness in his speech that some people found refreshing and others found uncomfortable, depending on what he was being direct about. He was also the most difficult of my children. And I want to be honest about this because the story I am telling is not a story about a perfect boy who was lost, but about a real boy who was complicated and who I loved with a completeness that included and was not diminished by the complications. He argued with James from an early age, the particular arguing of a boy who understands that he is not fully accepted by the man who occupies the father's position in his household, and who responds to this understanding with a resistance that looks like defiance, but is actually something closer to grief. James was not unkind to Daniel. He was simply not warm toward him, and the absence of warmth in a man who was the only father Daniel had known was something Daniel felt every day, and that neither James nor I ever found an adequate way to address. He argued with me, too, in the way of children who are most like their parents, and who therefore clash most directly with them. We had the arguments of people who understand each other well enough to know exactly where to press and who press there anyway, out of whatever combination of love and frustration drives people to be most difficult with the people they are most attached to. I knew how to manage these arguments most of the time. I knew how to let them run their course and return to the ordinary warmth that was the foundation underneath them most of the time, not always. The argument that preceded Daniel's leaving was not unusual in its surface content. It was about a young woman he wanted to marry, a girl from a family in the next county, whose people my husband James did not approve of, for reasons that had to do with old disputes between the families that predated Daniel's interest in the girl by 30 years. James forbade the match. Daniel declared his intention to pursue it anyway. I was caught between them, which was a position I had occupied before in their conflicts, and that I had always found exhausting. And on this occasion, I was more exhausted than usual, and I said things I should not have said. What I said specifically was that Daniel was being selfish, and that he was thinking only of himself, and not of what his choices cost the rest of the family. I said that if he proceeded against James's wishes, he would be choosing the girl over his own mother. I said this last thing with the full weight of a statement designed to wound, which is the worst use to which a mother's authority can be put. And I said it knowing it would wound, and I said it anyway because I was tired, and I was frustrated, and because the argument had been going on for 3 weeks, and I wanted it to be over. Daniel left the house that evening and did not come back that night. He came back the following morning, collected some of his things, and told me he was going to stay with his cousin Thomas in the valley to the east until things settled down. He said this in the flat, controlled tone of a young man who is very angry and who has decided that anger is not something he is going to display, which is a tone I recognized because it was the tone I used myself when I was very angry and had decided not to display it. He said goodbye. I said goodbye. Neither of us said anything else. I told myself he would be back within a week. I told myself he needed to cool down, and that when he cooled down, he would come back and we would talk properly, and I would tell him that I had spoken in anger, and that I did not mean to put it that way, that I was not asking him to choose between me and the girl, that I loved him and supported him, and that we would find a way through the disagreement with James that did not require him to feel abandoned by his own mother. I told myself I would write him a letter in the meantime. I did not write the letter. I want to tell you what the weeks between Daniel's leaving and Daniel's death looked like from the inside, because I think the inside of those weeks is the part that matters most for understanding what I have carried since. The first week I was certain he would come back or write. Daniel was not a person who sustained anger indefinitely. He felt things deeply, and he expressed them directly, and then he moved through them and came out the other side with the same directness he had brought to the feeling itself. I had seen him do this many times. I expected him to do it again. I went about my days with the expectation sitting quietly in the background, a low and confident prediction that the present situation was temporary and would shortly resolve itself in the ordinary way. He did not write in the first week. I told myself this was because he needed more time than usual. The argument had been more serious than our usual arguments, the wound I had delivered more precisely aimed. He needed time, and I would give him time, and when he was ready, he would write, or come back, and we would talk, and it would be all right. I should have written in the first week. I knew what I wanted to say. I had been composing it in my head since the morning after he left, turning the sentences over, finding the ones that said what I meant without saying more than I meant. I knew the letter. The letter existed, fully formed, in my mind. The only thing required was to sit down and put it on paper and send it. I did not sit down. Every day that first week I thought, I will write it this evening, after supper, when the children are settled and there is quiet. And every evening something prevented it, or nothing prevented it, and I simply did not do it, which is a distinction that I have spent 60 years trying to understand, and that I do not think I have understood. I am not certain there was a reason. I think the honest answer is that writing the letter would have required me to fully acknowledge what I had done. And fully acknowledging what I had done was something I was not yet ready to do. And so I kept the letter in my head, where it was composed and perfect, and did not carry the weight that putting it on paper would have given it. This is the thing I come back to. The letter in my head was still a letter I intended to write. A letter I intended to write did not require me to sit down and confront the fact that I had said to my son that he was choosing the girl over his own mother. As long as the letter remained in my head, it was still future, still something I was going to do. And the gap between what I had done and what I was going to do was not yet a fixed and permanent thing. Writing it would have closed that gap. Not writing it allowed me to keep the gap open, to exist in the space of intention without the accountability of action. I know this now. I did not know it then, or rather I knew it in the way that you know things you are not ready to fully look at. The peripheral knowing that lets you move around a thing without examining it directly. The second week I began to feel the first edge of unease. Not alarm, not yet. A low-level awareness that the silence was extending beyond what was ordinary for Daniel, who was not a person who maintained silences. I mentioned to James, with careful casualness, that I had not heard from Daniel and that I thought I should probably write to him at Thomas's. James said something noncommittal, which was his standard response to anything involving Daniel, and I said yes. I thought I would, and I thought I would, and I did not. In the third week, I wrote a letter to Daniel's cousin Thomas, not to Daniel directly, asking after him. This letter I actually wrote, which tells you something about my state of mind at the time. I could write to Thomas. Writing to Thomas did not require me to acknowledge what I had said to Daniel, or to offer what the acknowledgement required. Writing to Thomas was simply an inquiry, a gathering of information, a practical step. I wrote it and sent it and waited. Thomas's reply came in the middle of the fourth week. It said that Daniel had left his house after staying for 10 days. He had gone, Thomas believed, to join the volunteer company that was forming in the county to the east. He had told Thomas he intended to enlist. He had said he would write to his mother when he was settled. He had not written. I sat with Thomas's letter for a long time. The volunteer company. Daniel had been 22 years old. The Spanish-American War had begun in April of that year, 1898, and the country was raising volunteers, and Daniel, who had been living at his cousin's house in a state of anger and displacement that I had put him in, had apparently decided that this was the next thing. I wrote to Daniel that evening. Finally. After 4 weeks of composing the letter in my head and not putting it on paper, I sat down at the kitchen table after supper and I wrote it. It said what it had always said in my head. It said that I had spoken in anger. and that I did not mean to put it the way I had put it. It said that I was not asking him to choose, that I had never been asking him to choose, that I loved him without conditions, and that my love did not depend on his agreement with James, or with me about the girl, or about anything else. It said that I wanted him to come home, or to write and tell me where he was, and that I would come to him if he could not come to me. It was a good letter. It was the letter I should have written in the first week. I sealed it and addressed it to the military address Thomas had provided, which was a regimental address for the volunteers forming in the county to the east, and I sent it. It was returned 3 weeks later. The regiment had already deployed. The address was no longer valid. There was no forwarding address on the envelope, just the word returned in someone's handwriting, and the original address crossed out. I wrote to the regimental office for a forwarding address. They gave me one eventually, after 2 more weeks of waiting. I wrote to the new address. I waited again. His letter came in September of 1898, 3 months after he had left. It was short, 2 pages, written in the handwriting I had known since he had learned to make letters at the kitchen table when he was 6 years old. It said that he was well, and that he was with the regiment in Cuba, and that the conditions were difficult, but that he was managing. It said that he had received my letter, without specifying which letter or commenting on its contents, which I understood to mean that he had received it, and was not yet ready to respond to it directly. It said that he hoped everyone at home was well. It said that he would write again when he could. It was not a warm letter. It was not a cold letter either, not deliberately cold, not the flat, controlled tone of the morning he left. It was the letter of a young man who is in a difficult situation, and who is managing it, and who has not yet decided where he stands on the question of whether the difficult situation he has gotten himself into has anything to do with the argument he had with his mother before he left. I read this subtext clearly because I had written the same kind of letter myself in my time, and I knew what it meant and what it did not mean. It meant there was still time. It meant the door was not closed. It meant that when he came home we would finish what the letter had started, and we would be all right. The news came in October. It did not come in the form of an official letter, which I had heard was the way the Army notified families. It came in the form of Daniel's cousin Thomas appearing at my door on a Thursday morning with his hat in his hands and an expression on his face that I recognized before he had said a single word, because an expression like that on a young man's face at your door in wartime has only one meaning, and you know it the moment you see it. Daniel had died of fever in a military hospital in Tampa, Florida, on the 9th of October, 1898. He had been ill for 3 weeks. The regiment had come back from Cuba in August, and the fever had caught him in September in Florida, while he was waiting to be discharged and come home. He had been 22 years old. He had been 3 weeks from discharge. I stood at the door and I listened to Thomas tell me this, and I did not say anything for a long time. And then I said, "Thank you for coming," and I closed the door, and I sat down on the floor of the kitchen, not in a chair, on the floor itself, and I stayed there for a very long time. James was in the field. The children were at school. The house was empty, and I sat on the kitchen floor, and I understood, for the first time with full clarity, the exact nature of what I had done and what I had not done, and what the difference between those two things was going to cost me for the rest of my life. The letter I had written in the first week in my head had been the right letter. The letter I had finally written in the fourth week had reached him. He had written back, and in the letter he wrote back. He had not addressed what I had said to him, which meant he had died with my words still standing as the last full statement I had made to him about who he was to me, that he was choosing the girl over his own mother. Those words, those specific words. He had died 3 weeks from coming home, 3 weeks from the conversation in which we would have finished what the letter had started, and he had died with those words as part of the record between us, unaddressed and therefore unresolved, because I had waited 4 weeks to write a letter I had composed in my head the morning after he left. I sat on the kitchen floor and I understood all of this. I have understood it every hour of every day since. The grief of losing a child is something I will not attempt to describe in full, because I do not believe it is fully describable. What I will say is that it has a specific quality that is different from other griefs, a quality of incompleteness that other griefs do not have in quite the same way. When you lose a parent, you are losing someone who came before you, and whose leaving, however painful, has a kind of natural order to it. When you lose a child, you are losing someone who is supposed to outlast you, someone whose future you had imagined with the specificity that the death does not erase, but simply makes impossible. You are left holding a future that cannot happen, and the holding of it is its own kind of weight. What I carried was not only the grief of losing Daniel. I want to be precise about this, because the distinction matters. I carried the grief of losing Daniel, and I carried separately the knowledge of the letter. These two things were not the same thing, and they did not feel the same way. The grief of losing Daniel was enormous, and it changed over time, in the way that grief changes, not diminishing exactly, but shifting, becoming incorporated into the fabric of ordinary life rather than standing apart from it as an emergency. The knowledge of the letter did not change in this way. It stayed exactly the same. Every morning I woke up knowing what I knew, and it was as fresh in its specificity as it had been on the morning after Thomas came to my door. James did not grieve Daniel in the way I had hoped he would. I had a complicated hope about this that I can see now was not realistic, which was that the death of Daniel would cause James to feel the full weight of what his distance from the boy had cost, and that this feeling would produce in him something that resembled remorse, and that the remorse would somehow be useful to me in my own grief. This did not happen. James grieved Daniel in the limited way of a man who had not allowed himself to fully attach to a child, and who therefore did not have the depth of attachment to grieve. He was sober and respectful in the weeks following the news. He did not say anything wrong. He simply did not have much to say, and the absence of what he had to say was itself a kind of statement about the relationship he had had with Daniel, and I found it harder to forgive than I had expected to. I told him about the letter. Not immediately, not in the first weeks when the grief was in its acute phase, but later in the winter, when the acute phase had settled into the chronic one, and I was living in the ordinary continuation of loss rather than its first catastrophe. I told him about the argument and about the letter I had composed in my head and not written for 4 weeks, and about the words I had said to Daniel before he left. I told him all of it, sitting at the kitchen table in the January of 1899, with the mountain winter outside the window and the lamp burning between us. James listened. He said that I had not known Daniel would die. He said that the letter I eventually wrote had reached Daniel, and that Daniel had written back, and that the relationship was in the process of being repaired when Daniel died, which was true, and that I could not have known it would not be completed. He said these things in the practical, reasonable way of a man who approaches most problems as engineering problems, and who was trying, in the way available to him, to be helpful. He was not wrong about any of it, and none of it touched the thing I was trying to tell him about, which was not a question of what I had known or not known, but a question of what I had done and not done, and why, and what it meant that I had held the letter in my head for 4 weeks, while my son was living at his cousin's house in a state of displacement that I had caused. James did not have the vocabulary for this kind of conversation, and I do not blame him for it. He was made the way he was made, and he did what he could with what he had, as most people do. I did not tell him that I believed the argument itself, the one that had sent Daniel away, would not have happened the way it happened if James had been a different kind of father to Daniel. I did not tell him this because it would not have been fair, and because fairness mattered to me even when the truth was unkind. Daniel's anger at his situation had made him more rigid about the girl than he might otherwise have been. My own exhaustion from years of managing between them had made me say the thing I said. These were connections I could make, and that carried a kind of weight of their own. But they were not James's fault in the direct sense that would have made the telling useful, and so I did not tell him. The girl married someone else the following year. I heard this through the ordinary channels of county news, and I noted it without feeling much about it either way, because by that point the girl had ceased to be a figure in my interior life, except as the occasion of the argument, and the argument had long since resolved itself into the specific shape of the letter I had not written, and the words I should not have said. I have thought about the girl over the years. I have wondered whether Daniel would have been happy with her. I have wondered whether the happiness or unhappiness of that hypothetical marriage would have made any difference to the question I am actually concerned with, which is not about the girl at all, but about the letter. I do not think it would have made any difference. The letter was the letter regardless of whether Daniel married the girl or didn't, regardless of whether the argument was about something important or trivial. What mattered was not the subject of the argument. What mattered was that I had said what I said, and had then held the apology in my head for 4 weeks, while my son was gone. My daughter Clara, who is the most perceptive of my children, and who has her grandmother's warmth and something of my father's bluntness, said to me once, in the years after Daniel died, that I was not responsible for the war and the fever that killed him. She said this with the directness and the love that characterized most of her serious conversations with me, looking at me across a kitchen table the way she had looked at me across kitchen tables her whole life, with the expression of a woman who wants to say something true and useful, and is not sure the truth is going to be received as useful. I told her she was right. I told her I knew I was not responsible for the war or the fever. I told her what I was responsible for, and I told it to her plainly, the same way I have told it here. And she listened, and when I was done, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said that she understood and that it was a terrible thing to carry and that she was sorry. She did not tell me to let it go or to forgive myself or to remember that Daniel had known I loved him. She did not offer me the consolations that people usually offer when you tell them about a thing like this, the consolations that are designed to relieve the discomfort of the listener as much as the pain of the speaker. She simply said she understood and she was sorry, and then she took my hand across the table and held it. This was the right thing to do. I have always been grateful to her for doing it. What I have found in 60 years of carrying the knowledge of the letter is that the caring changes in texture, but not in weight. In the early years it was sharp, the way new grief is sharp, with edges that caught on everything and drew blood in unexpected moments. A sound, a smell, a particular quality of autumn light that recalled the autumn of 1898 when the letter I had written finally went and came back unanswerable. In the middle years it became duller, more constant, less likely to surprise, but more thoroughly present, a permanent background condition rather than an acute one. Now, at 70, it is simply there, the way the mountains are there outside my window, large and permanent and entirely familiar, not painful in the way it was painful in 1899, but not absent either, never absent. There are things I have learned from it. I tell them to you not because I think advice is what this story is for, but because 60 years of daily consideration of a single question produces something, and what it has produced in me seems worth stating. The first thing I have learned is that intention is not action, and should not be treated as action. The letter in my head was not a letter. It was a thing I was going to do, and the doing of it was the only thing that would have made it real. I know this now with a completeness that I did not have when I was 47 years old, and holding an apology in my mind as though the holding were equivalent to the delivering. The second thing I have learned is that the people you love do not have unlimited time, and neither do you, and the assumption that there is time is the assumption that has cost me everything I have lost, not only Daniel. I say this carefully because I do not want to suggest that I have spent 60 years losing things. I have not. I have had a life that contained real love and real work and real satisfaction, and I have been present for more of it than I was not present for. But the specific losses that I would take back, if I could take anything back, the moments when I held something that needed to be given and did not give it, all of them have had the same shape as the letter. The assumption of time, the deferral of the thing that mattered. The morning when I would sit down and write what I had been composing in my head, write the letter. That is what 60 years of this has taught me. Whatever the letter is, whatever form it takes, whatever it costs you to sit down and acknowledge what you need to acknowledge and say what you need to say, write it today. Write it now. Do not hold it in your head where it exists in a condition of perpetual intention that feels like action because you can feel yourself meaning to do it. Write the letter. Daniel did not come home. The fever took him in Tampa on the 9th of October, 3 weeks before his discharge. He was 22 years old and he was 3 weeks from home. And I had written to him in September, and he had written back. And the conversation was not finished, and it never was finished, and it never will be. And I think about this every hour of every day. I have thought about it every hour of every day for 60 years. I will think about it every hour of every day for whatever hours remain, which may be few or many, and which I cannot know, and which is precisely the point. James died in 1912, 14 years after Daniel. He died in the same bedroom where he had slept for 36 years of our marriage, in the early morning of a November day when the mountains outside the window were bare, and the sky was the flat gray of late autumn. He died as he had lived, quietly and without drama, going from sleep to death without any visible transition, which the doctor said was as peaceful a way to go as there was, and which I believed, but which also meant there was no final conversation, no last chance to say the things that long marriages accumulate, and that people sometimes say at the end, when the ordinary constraints of the living relationship no longer apply. I had made a kind of peace with James over the 14 years between Daniel's death and his own. Not a warm peace, not the peace of full understanding or full forgiveness, but the practical peace of two people who have shared a life for a long time and who have arrived, through the accumulated weight of shared experience, at a mutual recognition that is not quite tenderness, but is not its absence either. We had grown old together, which is not nothing, and in the growing old we had become more patient with each other than we had been in the years of active life, when everything was sharper and the space for patience was smaller. I found after James died that the house was quieter than it had been, even in the years when the children were grown and gone, which had already been quiet enough. Quiet in the particular way of a house that has always had a man in it, and that suddenly does not. A quiet that is less about sound than about the absence of a certain kind of presence. A weight in the rooms that you do not notice until it is no longer there. I adjusted to this quiet in the way that older women in those years adjusted to widowhood, which is to say practically and without excessive complaint, because excessive complaint was not available to me as an option given how I had been raised and how I had lived. Clara was nearby, which was a comfort. She had married a man from the county and settled 3 miles east, close enough for regular visiting, and close enough that she came to check on me with a frequency that I sometimes found slightly smothering, and always found fundamentally reassuring. She had 2 daughters and a son, my grandchildren, who came to my house on Sundays, and who were, in their various ways, the greatest comfort of my later years. The eldest grandchild, a girl named Dorothy after me, had Daniel's eyes. I noticed this when she was about 4 years old. One Sunday morning, when she was sitting at my kitchen table eating the cornbread I had made and looking at something outside the window with a quality of absorption that was so entirely familiar that I had to look away for a moment. She had his coloring too, the dark hair that came from James's side of the family, and the way she tilted her head when she was thinking reminded me of him, with a specificity that surprised me even after all the years, because I had thought I had grown accustomed to the small recurrences that memory produces, and that catch you off guard when you are not prepared for them. I did not tell Clara this. There are certain things that belong to the person who carries them, and that do not benefit from being shared, and the observation that Dorothy had Daniel's eyes was one of them. Clara knew the outline of what had happened with Daniel, the argument and the letter and the fever in Tampa. She did not need to carry the additional weight of knowing that her eldest daughter's eyes reminded me of her dead brother, every Sunday morning at the kitchen table. Some weights are not transferable and should not be attempted. What I watched in Dorothy as she grew was something I had not expected to watch, which was a version of Daniel that was not Daniel, but that rhymed with him, the way a melody in a different key rhymes with its original. She had his directness. She had his stubbornness. She had his warmth, which expressed itself in her as an easy and genuine interest in the people around her, a quality of paying attention that made people feel seen. She was, at 14 and 15 and 16, the age Daniel had been when I had first understood who he was as a person, distinct from the child I had raised. A person I respected and whose company I actively enjoyed. I watched her argue with her mother the way Daniel had argued with me. I watched Clara navigate those arguments with the patience and the occasional failure of patience that I recognized because I had navigated the same arguments myself with the same person in a different generation. I wanted to tell Clara things, specific things, practical things, about how to manage the particular stubbornness that Daniel had had and that Dorothy had inherited. And sometimes I told her these things and sometimes I held them, depending on whether the telling seemed likely to be useful or to simply add to the weight Clara was already carrying. I never told Dorothy about Daniel directly. I told her he had existed and that he had been her mother's uncle and that he had died young, which is the appropriate level of information to give a child about a family death that predated her birth. I did not tell her that she reminded me of him. I did not tell her about the argument or the letter. These things were not hers to carry, but I watched her with the particular attention of someone who is seeing two things at once: the person in front of you and the person they recall. And the watching was both a comfort and a difficulty that I have never quite found the words for. It was a comfort because it was a form of continuation, Daniel's particular way of being a person persisting in someone who had never known him. It was a difficulty because it was also a daily reminder of what had ended and when and how and why. There was a Sunday when Dorothy was about 15, and she and Clara had argued about something. I no longer remember what. And Dorothy had come to my kitchen with the flat, controlled expression I recognized, and had sat across from me at the table and said nothing for a while. And I had made tea and sat down with her, and also said nothing. And after a while she had said without preamble, "I don't think she understands me." I looked at her across the table. She had Daniel's eyes, and she had his expression when he was trying to contain something large. And she was 15 years old, and she was sitting in the chair where he had sat and saying the thing he had felt. And I looked at her for a moment, and I said, "She understands you better than you know." And then I said, "And whatever you are feeling right now, don't let it sit. Don't wait for the right moment or for things to settle down. Say what you need to say today, even if today is not perfect, especially if today is not perfect." Dorothy looked at me with the directness that was one of the things she had from him, and she said, "Why especially?" I said, "Because there is no guarantee of tomorrow, and the words you hold today may be the words that define you if tomorrow doesn't come." She was 15, and she could not have fully understood what I was telling her, not in the way I meant it, not with the 60 years of specific knowledge behind it. But she looked at me, and she nodded in the way of a young person who understands that an older person is telling them something that costs the older person something to say, and she took it seriously, which was all I could ask. She went home that evening, and she and Clara had the rest of the conversation they needed to have, Clara told me later. Clara said Dorothy had come to her and said she wanted to finish talking. Clara had been surprised by this because Dorothy was not usually the one who initiated the repairs after their arguments, which was something she recognized from her own relationship with me. They had talked, and it had been good, and Clara had been grateful. I told Clara that I was glad. I did not tell her why Dorothy had done it, or what I had said to her. That was between me and the girl who had Daniel's eyes, and who had 15 years of life ahead of her in which to practice what I had told her, which was everything I had failed to practice myself. I have thought many times about whether telling Dorothy what I told her constitutes some form of redemption or repair for what I failed to do with Daniel. I have decided that it does not, that the categories do not overlap in that way, that what I did wrong cannot be undone by doing right with someone else, even if the someone else rhymes with the person I wronged. Redemption, if it exists, works differently than that. It is not transferable across people any more than the letter itself was transferable. But I think it may have been useful to Dorothy, and usefulness when you are 70 years old and looking back at a life that has contained its failures as well as its better moments, is something worth holding on to, even if it is not redemption, even if it is simply a small right thing done late, in the long aftermath of a wrong thing done early. It is still something, and something is what I have. I am 70 years old, and I live alone in the house that James built on the property my father left to me, in the mountains of what has been West Virginia now for almost 60 years, since the state separated from Virginia during the war. The mountains outside my window are the same mountains that were outside my window when I was a child, when I was a young woman, when I was a mother, and they do not change in any way that is visible within a human lifetime, which is something I find both comforting and faintly humbling. They were here before I was, and they will be here after me, and the things that happened in their vicinity, the lives that were lived at their feet, are not recorded anywhere in their permanent gray-blue faces, which regard the valley below them with the same expression they have always had. Daniel is buried in the county cemetery, which is where James is buried, and where my parents are buried, and where I expect I will be buried when the time comes. I visit the grave regularly, which is something I have done since they brought his body home from Tampa in the winter of 1898, and we buried him on a cold December day, with the mountains white above us and more people than I had expected standing at the graveside, because Daniel had been well liked in the county in the way of young men who have his particular combination of warmth and directness, who make people feel both comfortable and fully engaged at the same time. I stand at the grave and I do not say much. I have tried at various points over the years to speak to him there, to say the things the letter said and the things the letter did not say, to finish the conversation we did not finish. I have found that I cannot do this convincingly. It feels like a performance, and Daniel was not a person who responded well to performance, who would have seen through it immediately and called it what it was. What I do instead is stand there and know that I am standing there and that he is in the ground, and that I love him, and that I am sorry. And I let that be enough, because it is what I have, and because being honest about what you have is better than performing what you wish you had. I want to talk about what it means to regret something every hour of every day, because I think the phrase sounds more dramatic than the reality, and I want to be accurate. It does not mean that I am incapacitated. It does not mean that Daniel occupies every waking thought, or that I am unable to function in the ordinary world, or that the grief is permanently in its acute form. I have lived, as I have said, a full life in the 60 years since he died. I have been present for my children and grandchildren. I have maintained friendships and done useful work and found pleasure in the small daily things that constitute most of what a life actually consists of. I have not been a woman destroyed by her regret, visibly diminished by it in ways that others could see. What it means is something more interior than that. It means that the knowledge of the letter is present in me at all times, at every hour of every day, in the way that a permanent physical condition is present, not always in the foreground, not always demanding attention, but never absent. It is there when I wake in the morning, and it is there when I go to sleep at night, and it is there in between, in the background of every hour, a constant low note underneath everything else. Some hours are harder than others. The October hours have always been the hardest, because Daniel died in October, and the quality of October light in these mountains has a particular character that I have never been able to separate from the year it was that quality of light when the news came. Autumn is difficult in general. The hour just after supper, when the household is settling, and there is a moment of quiet before the evening's work, is difficult in a way I have never fully explained to myself, except that it was often the hour I told myself I would sit down and write the letter and did not. These are the hours when the regret is not background but foreground, when it requires active management rather than passive accommodation. But even in those hours I function. I make supper and I eat it, and I do the dishes and I go to bed. I do not perform my grief for anyone, because Daniel would have found that insufferable, and because it does not, in any case, serve any purpose that I can identify. The regret is mine. It belongs to me. I carry it. I have been asked on several occasions over the years whether I have forgiven myself. This question comes from people who mean well and who are operating from a framework in which self-forgiveness is the appropriate resolution to the kind of thing I carry. I understand the framework. I do not find it useful. What I would say about self-forgiveness is this. I did not know Daniel would die. I did not write the letter for 4 weeks because I was not ready to write it. And not being ready to write it was a failure of courage and a form of self-protection that I can understand, and that I would have done differently if I had known what I know now. But I did not know what I know now. I was 47 years old, and my son had left after an argument, and I believed there was time, and I was wrong. This does not make what I did forgivable exactly, but it makes it comprehensible, which is perhaps as much as I can ask. What I will not do is use comprehensibility as a substitute for accountability. I know what I did and what I did not do, and I know what the cost was. Forgiving myself in the sense of releasing myself from the knowledge and the caring of it would require me to treat the cost as something other than what it was, and I am not willing to do that. The cost was real. Daniel is real. The letter that was never written is real. These things deserve to be held and not released, because releasing them would be a form of disrespect to the boy who deserved the letter and did not get it in time. So I carry it. I will carry it. And in the caring, I try to be, on balance, a person who does not make the same kind of mistake again, who does not hold things in her head that need to be given, who does not assume that tomorrow is guaranteed and that the important things can wait. This is the only useful thing that 60 years of this has taught me. Not a consolation and not a remedy, but a practice. Something I try to do with the time I have left, in recognition of the time that was wasted. Say the thing. Write the letter. Today, not tomorrow. Not when the moment is better, or when you are more ready, or when the other person has come around, or when things have settled down. Today, in whatever imperfect form it takes, with whatever limitations the present moment imposes on it. Today, because the present moment is what you have. The future moment you are counting on may not come, and if it does not come, you will be left, as I have been left, holding in your hands the perfect thing you were saving for a perfect moment that never arrived, standing at a grave in the mountain winter with the words still in you and nowhere to put them. I am 70 years old, and I know exactly what the letter would have said. Every word of it. I have known every word of it for 60 years, and I will know every word of it until I am in the ground, beside Daniel and beside James, and beside everyone else I have loved and lost, and spoken to well and spoken to badly, and had more time with and not enough time with. I know every word of the letter I never wrote. I will know it at the last hour of the last day, as I have known it at every hour of every day since the autumn of 1898. Write the letter, whatever it costs you. Write it today. That is all I know. That is everything I know. I offer it to you in the hope that it is worth more to you than it has been to me, because you still have time to use it, and time is the only thing that matters, and you have more of it than you know until one day you do not.